So thank you very much for inviting me to the conference, and I'm very much looking forward to talking about some of the ideas presented in this presentation afterwards. I'm here to talk about the role of metaphor in witchcraft, and by metaphor I'm talking about when people talk about one thing in terms of another, but as you'll see throughout this talk, metaphor is much more than that. It's also about metaphorical ways of acting and ways of behaving and ways of thinking, as well as just in language. And in order to illustrate why and how I'm talking about metaphor, I thought I'd just start with an example. And this example comes from an account of a child who who was accused of being a witch when she was brought over from Africa. And this is something that happened to her when she was ill and she'd been sick. So if you look at this example, this child is literally vomiting, but this literal action is interpreted metaphorically by the stepmother as being a kind of like the witchcraft that's being vomited out of her. So it's the kind of like, it's a single action that's taking place with two very, very different interpretations. And this is what I mean by metaphor, where somebody interprets something that's kind of like quite literal in very metaphorical terms, in very kind of like, in very abstract terms. This kind of language is very, very common throughout a lot of the discussions of witchcraft. Here's another example. This is an example from a girl who was taken to the pastor after having been accused of being a witch, and she got very, very hot at this point, and she took off her jacket. Again, a kind of literal behaviour. But if you notice here the reaction of the parents here, my parents opened their eyes at this point and stared up at the pastor in front of me. That's because, again, they're interpreting this kind of like heat in kind of like in more metaphorical terms. So like the heat is perhaps the devil trying to get out of her. And rather worrying, the pastor says, "Are you hot? Well, you haven't seen anything yet." So obviously the signs of things that are going to come are going to happen to her. Interestingly, the comment on this is that the meaning associated with the action had inadvertently fed into the pastor's conclusion. So both of these examples come from a very, very interesting piece of research, which is co-written by somebody who'd experienced being accused of being a witch, with a researcher writing a kind of researcher's perspective on her experiences. And so you see these examples of metaphorical thinking going on in both these examples. And I'm going to be talking a bit about this idea of whether something is a metaphor for one person and a literal thing for another person. So this idea of kind of like activated metaphoricity. So we think we use metaphor all the time. We use metaphor in very, very everyday expressions. So we might say, for example, like in 2 weeks there, like the in. Some people might see that as a metaphor because it's not literally in anything. But most of the time with metaphor, we don't even think of it as metaphor. It's just kind of the language that we use. But sometimes and in certain occasions, the metaphoricity of language kind of wakes up and becomes much more activated. And I'm going to be arguing and showing that this is what often happens in the case of witchcraft or faith-based abuse. And I'm going to be referring throughout this talk to a study conducted by Eleanor Stobart in 2006. She looked at approximately 6 years of child abuse in the UK, where witchcraft had some level of involvement. And if you notice that out of the 47 children studied, 20 were Christian, 5 Muslim, 1 Hindu, 1 mixed, 11 unknown. That doesn't mean to say that they weren't religious of some description. So I'm going to be using the term faith-based abuse because I think it's not just about witchcraft here. Coming on to this idea of like this activated metaphor that I touched on before, what I'm really saying here is that metaphors are often kind of just buried in the language and we don't notice them, but sometimes they wake up, they become more activated. And so this is an example, first of all, taken from a conversation here between a woman who is works at the university, and she's talking about organisational analysis and the way organisations work. And she's explaining the organisation by saying it's like a piano. And so she's making this comparison between the organisation of the piano. This is the left hand of the piano, keeping the old beat and the keys going. This bit could be the fancy fiddly bits at the right hand and the right hand of the piano and high notes. And if you notice here, she's got her hands like this. This is not actually how we play the piano. Most pianos are not kind of like vertical, most pianos are horizontal. So you've got two metaphors going on here. One is like the comparison with the piano, and this other one is like the idea of low notes and high notes. And the low notes and high notes is something that we might normally not even see as a metaphor, because that's just the way we talk about notes. But other languages don't use that metaphor. Some would use thick notes and thin notes, or sort of male notes, female notes, that kind of thing. So it's not as if this is a universal way of talking about music, but by bringing in this gesture, she wakes up this metaphor. There are a lot of studies showing that metaphor is something that we experience kind of on a physical level as well as on a linguistic level, and which is why it can be so potent and so such a strong force for shaping the way people behave and the way people think. So there's three metaphors here. These are just examples. There are hundreds of studies like the ones that I'm going to show you. These all show very kind of like everyday mundane ways of thinking metaphorically, and how they have kind of physical manifestations. So we often talk about importance in terms of weight. So we say like a very weighty matter, a very heavy issue, or we might talk about a lightweight subject or whatever. There's been interesting studies showing that if you give people a book that looks a bit like this one, and you ask them to assess how important the content of that book is likely to be, if you give the book to people, in the studies, the groups have been split into two. Half the people have received the book just as it is, and half the people have received the book containing a concealed weight, so it's actually physically a heavier book. And the people with the heavier book will more often than not say that it's about more important subject matter than the people with the lighter book. So you've got the kind of like a difference here, and this is a significant difference. Another metaphor which we kind of live with is resemblance's proximity. So we might say this shade of purple is similar to that shade of purple, so it's near that shade. Whereas this has also been shown to be kind of like an almost kind of like a lived metaphor. So people on a screen are shown, in a study, are shown words like pride and duty and anger and meekness, and they're asked to assess how close the words are in meaning. And studies have shown if you manipulate the physical distance of those words, so if you actually put them physically further apart on the screen, people are more likely to say that they have less similarities in meaning than if they're close to each other on the screen. So this is this idea of resemblance's proximity. Finally, moral and immoral deeds. This is quite an interesting study. So the idea that morality is cleanliness, and of course this relates a lot to religion and also to some of the things we're talking about today. This has also got a physical basis. So there's an interesting study where people were taken into a room and asked to think about either a very moral deed that they had been engaged in or an immoral deed. And then after the study, on their way out, people were invited they were offered a free gift as a kind of thank you for participating in the study. And they were offered like a bar of chocolate or a thing of antiseptic wipes. And the people who'd recall the immoral deed are significantly more likely to choose the antiseptic wipes, which I think is quite an interesting study. And this is stronger in people of a right-wing political persuasion and people with stronger religions, which is quite interesting. So these are kind of like these activated metaphors. But I think one of the things that I'm going to be talking about mostly now is like not all metaphors are activated all of the time to the same extent. So sometimes they're just kind of like things that we use in language, and other times they're very powerful things that shape the way in which we think and behave. And I'm going to argue that in the witchcraft and in the exorcisms, there's a very strong case of metaphoricity waking up. And I'm going to be looking at why that is and what causes that to happen. So there are studies that show that metaphoricity is most likely to wake up when it's enacted, so kind of acted out, when it's experienced from the first person perspective, when it's made particularly salient or noticeable, and when emotion is involved. And so with enactment, I think if you're looking at what's happening with witchcraft and faith-based abuse, you've got an awful lot of metaphorical enactment. So these are from the Stobart study that I mentioned earlier. And these are some of the things that happen to the children during the exorcisms: beating, burning, cutting, strangulation, etc. And if you look at the explanations that are offered for why these things take place, you can see a huge amount of metaphorical thinking going on here, but very active metaphorical thinking, so squeezing the life out of the evil, weakening the evil spirit, etc. Similarly, with other things that happen to the children, it's not always about a single metaphor. Sometimes they combine more than one metaphor, so they're even more powerful and they're even more likely to be experienced and lived. So the children are sometimes often held underwater. And here you've got the combination of the metaphor of cleanliness and baptism mixed with the kind of like suffering and weakening the evil. Similarly, having chili peppers, salt or ginger applied to eyes and genitals. So here you've got the combination of the pain, the physical pain, the heat and the pain. But if you look at the eyes and the genitals, this is where the evil maybe comes out through the eyes or is reproduced through the genitals. So you've got a lot of metaphorical thinking feeding into this very, very metaphorical enacted behaviour here. Metaphors are also most likely to be activated when they're experienced from the first person perspective. So this finding comes from studies into what's known as the fictive motion metaphor. And this idea is that when people are talking about a path, you can talk about a path travelling over rough ground, or a road running along the coast. Now, if you think about it, literally, the path isn't actually travelling anywhere, or the road isn't actually going anywhere. It's just there, it's stationary. But we have this idea of motion to describe like the path or the route of the path. There have been studies that shown that if you play people recordings of sentences where, for example, you have the path runs over smooth ground, whereas contrasted with the path runs over rough ground, it actually and then you track people's eyes looking at the particular path in question. It takes them much longer to move their eyes over the path when it's running over rough ground than it does when it's the smooth ground, which suggests that people are kind of like internalising and mentally simulating the action of that path moving. And this effect is significantly stronger when the path is presented from the first person than when it's presented from the third person. So this idea of this first person perspective emphasising the strength of metaphor is a very important one, I think, in terms of the witchcraft debates, because it shows that this is like when the metaphors are internalised. And there's a lot of this in the accounts that I've been reading of the witchcraft. So here from the Stobart, one child fasted him or herself in the belief that it would provide a cure. So here, the child has internalised this kind of fasting is purity metaphor, and they're enacting it themselves. And as we'll see later, these metaphors tend to become even stronger when the children internalise them than they are when they're inflicted on them by the parents and the pastor. Metaphors are most likely to be activated when they're made salient. And of course, a lot of the literature on the faith-based child abuse shows that often children are picked on for accusations when they are a child with a difference, when there's something unusual about them, when they're made salient, when they stand out. And so these are the kinds of children who were chosen to be accused of witches. So children with epilepsy, children who stammer, children with deafness, learning disabilities, autism, etc. All of these things, again, you've got kind of, these are quite literal behaviours interpreted metaphorically as if there's some kind of evil in the children. And I think emotionally resonant, that runs through the whole lot of it. Basically, the whole experience is emotionally resonant. There's emotions on all fronts. And so that works again to intensify the metaphoricity. So these are 4 reasons why the metaphors are much stronger in witchcraft than they might be in kind of everyday experience. Other factors that shape the strength of the metaphoricity are individual differences, and I would argue that all of these individual differences have some kind of bearing on the witchcraft debates. I'm going to talk very briefly about just 6 of them. And the first one is gender. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but there is some a certain amount of research suggesting that some of these metaphors are stronger in men than they are in women, and that women's understanding of the metaphors relates more to the linguistic environment in which they're exposed to them. So they're kind of like, they're owned by men and kind of appropriated by women. And this kind of, this is relevant to the witchcraft debates because of course the pastors are always men, and even though the children are male and female. And this relates to power dimensions as well. But I've got specific examples of the other ones. So stress and depression. This is the experience of stress and depression has also been found to affect people's experience of metaphor. And in the Stobart study, they recorded that an awful lot of people who are in a situation of perpetrating this violence on children, they are themselves in very, very stressful situations because they've emigrated to new countries. They're managing a lot of of difficulties, often related to poverty, and there's a lot of mental health, a lot of stress and depression. And this is just as an example of how this can kind of change the way people see the world metaphorically. This is a work from Nadeau, who looked at the accounts of people suffering from depression, and here you have an account of somebody, how they describe their depressing experience. If you just look at that for a minute while I just have a sip of water. So this is an example of how when people experience particularly depressing situations, they often use metaphor much more creatively in order to describe their experiences, and they experience their depression as metaphor. Schizophrenia as well. A number of, in the Stobart study, a number of the people involved in perpetrating the violence were schizophrenics. And here we have an example of somebody, the kind of schizophrenic mindset, again looking at how they're using metaphor to shape how their experience with their kind of the voices that are occupying their heads. So I'm not saying here that, like, all schizophrenics are going to become perpetrators of faith-based abuse, but there are kind of like things that come together here. These are kind of possible factors that need to be looked at in looking at why people are doing these kinds of things. Religion, well, obviously a lot of it is related to religion. These are kind of these are metaphors that are kind of enshrined within religions, and in a lot of religions these metaphors are acted out during the religious services. Again, very, very embodied, very, very lived, very physical metaphors. Cross-cultural variation, even though there isn't time to go into a lot of this, I think this is something that is well worth looking at. There's been a lot of research showing that there's huge variation across languages and cultures in terms of the way people use metaphor, particularly to talk about emotions, senses and the body. And I think these relate particularly strongly to witchcraft, and this is something that I think would be well worth investigating further. And finally on this list we've got age. So with these other ones, these previous ones, we've been talking about it in terms of the people who are inflicting the violence on the children. Of course, if you look at the children themselves, then it's important to look at how children experience metaphor in comparison with how adults experience metaphor. And studies have shown that it's actually children's experiences of metaphor are quite different from those of adults. So first of all, they have a lot of cross-sensory metaphor, so they understand kind of like sound in terms of images, or touch in terms of taste, etc. So a lot of kind of like physical senses involved in their metaphor. Metaphor is understood in terms of personal experience, and also personal experience shapes their own use of metaphor. Emotion, the children have much stronger emotional responses to metaphor, and they tend to interpret it much more literally. So basically what this is about children internalising the metaphors that the adults use and experiencing them much more strongly in a way. This is an example here. So here the child is talking about major and minor chords, and she says this one sounds like a bell and this one sounds like when you're dead. So you can see that she's relating it to very personal experience. And we've got a number of accounts of the children internalising the metaphors and kind of living them even more strongly than they were when the adults were imposing them on them. And so this are the individual differences. And to sum up, these are all the factors that are likely to shape the extent to which a metaphor is kind of experienced or lived or kind of wakes up. And I've argued, and this is kind of like just sort of the tip of the iceberg, these are likely to affect the witchcraft experiences of the children and the people who are performing the exorcisms or accusing them of witchcraft and so on. So, possible ways of perhaps using metaphor to address some of this faith-based abuse. Metaphor, if we looked at it, if we analyse it, is a way to access the emotional landscape of the abuser and also the abused. So the metaphors that people are using and enacting can kind of get at the way they're thinking about the whole experience. Metaphorical thinking is a key indicator of the cultural practice of witchcraft, and that brings in the sort of the cross-cultural elements of witchcraft as well. And perhaps most importantly, metaphor is a vehicle for reframing, so getting people to kind of rethink about what they're doing and rethinking the metaphors that are shaping their actions. So I'm talking here about the people who are the perpetrators, but also the children who've internalised these metaphors. How do we get them out of this kind of metaphorical thinking so that they're not suffering quite so much? There's an example of a study. There's a number of studies that have looked at the ways in which metaphor can reframe people's views of things. This is just one study here, and this is a debate that took place a while ago now when Lithuania was looking for independence from the Soviet Union. Here we have the Russian representative, so it's a debate between a Russian representative and a Lithuanian representative. The Russian representative says to divorce immediately would be too radical a solution, as both countries would undergo a great deal of pain in stabilising their economy. So he sets up this kind of divorce metaphor. And if you notice the Lithuanian, he picks up that divorce metaphor. He says, it cannot be said that we were going through a divorce because we were never even married. Lithuania was simply raped. So he kind of gets this divorce metaphor and runs with it and then gives it a twist at the final minute. And you can see how he's completely won that debate. And that's a good illustration of how, in order to kind of change people's metaphorical thinking, you've got to work with the metaphors that they're using in the first place. You can't just come along with a completely new metaphor and impose it on them. So metaphorical reframing is successful if you work with existing metaphors that people are using, if you make it very salient and noticeable, if you personalise it and make it about them, first-person perspective, reinforce it. But in faith-based abuse, well, as far as I'm aware, none of this has been tried out, but I think it would be well worth investigating the potential benefits of metaphorical reframing in faith-based abuse. So that's where the big question mark is. And I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.